On June 13, 1971, the New York Times released excerpts of a series of classified government documents referencing the Vietnam War. These documents, now known as the Pentagon Papers, reveal the true extent of American involvement in Vietnam, which had spanned far longer than was publicly known. Additionally, they revealed that America's progress in the Vietnam War had been largely overstated. These Pentagon Papers were leaked to the New York Times by a former Department of Defense employee, dubbed by Henry Kissinger as the most dangerous man in America, a man we now know as Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg's disclosure of the Pentagon Papers radically changed the general public's perception of the Vietnam War and the United States government, as he took a stand against a facade spanning 4 presidential administrations. Daniel Ellsberg was born in Chicago on April 7, 1931, but spent the majority of his early life in Detroit. Ellsberg was raised while the Cold War was at its peak, as Stalin was taking over countries in Eastern Europe. This eventually pushed Ellsberg towards a career in government. Ellsberg attended both Harvard and Cambridge University to study economics, and later served 3 years in the Marine Corps. After his military service, Ellsberg returned to Harvard for his PhD and became a strategic analyst for the Rand Corporation, a think tank for military and international issues. One day in July of 1964, the Assistant Secretary of Defense, John McNaughton, stopped by Ellsberg's office. McNaughton wanted Ellsberg on his task force for Vietnam, and Ellsberg accepted the job. On Ellsberg's first day at the Pentagon, U.S. destroyers were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin while they were on patrol. On August 4th, a second incident occurred in the area in which the destroyers stationed there thought they were being attacked by torpedoes. Those who were present during the alleged attack had some doubts about whether or not they had been attacked at all, fearing that the weather and nervousness had made them jump to conclusions. With a report of another attack back in Washington, Lyndon B. Johnson jumped to take immediate action without waiting for further investigation, ordering an aerial attack on Vietnamese patrol boat bases, officially escalating what became known as the Vietnam War. Ellsberg had doubts about the attack on August 4th, and he soon learned the truth about South Vietnamese attacks in North Vietnam, finding that their operations had been planned by the CIA. The U.S. Navy provided swift boats, weaponry, and training to the South Vietnamese. Ellsberg did not want to reveal his findings initially, as he disliked whistleblowers at the time. He believed in the cause of the Vietnam War and spent 12 hours a day at the Pentagon during the onset of the conflict, spending most of his time reading documents and deciding if they were important enough to send to Robert McNamara, the U.S. Secretary of Defense. One night, while Ellsberg was working a late shift to sort documents, his curiosity got the best of him. He picked up a binder from a safe labeled McNaughton Eyes Only that had intrigued him, and he went through a few paragraphs before returning the file to its place. However, the next day Ellsberg was called to McNaughton's office and told that he was being transferred to a new department. Although McNaughton framed it as a promotion, Ellsberg knew that McNaughton had found out about his unauthorized viewing of the binder and that he had been demoted because of it. During his time working in McNaughton's office, Ellsberg realized that, contrary to what the Pentagon claimed publicly, U.S. policy in Vietnam was failing. Ellsberg decided that he wanted to help the war effort more directly, so he took up a job working for the State Department in Vietnam. He was assigned to a team whose goal was to find peaceful means of ending communist support in Vietnam. However, after spending 2 years in Vietnam, Ellsberg became further discouraged about the war, as he saw that the U.S. was essentially fighting a war of attrition which had come to a stalemate. Ellsberg came back to work for the Rand Corporation with less faith in the Vietnam War than ever before.
That he went there very gung-ho about, I'm going to fix it myself kind of thing. And when he saw, especially when he went out on patrols with the guys, which he wasn't really supposed to do, he wasn't a soldier at that point, but he really saw on the ground what was actually happening when they would go into villages, and that we were hurting the people we were there to help. I think that's ultimately what turned it for him.
In 1967, Robert McNamara became disillusioned by the Vietnam War and asked McNaughton to compile a report of classified documents so that the U.S. could avoid repeating past mistakes. This report, officially known as History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam, would eventually be known to the public as the infamous Pentagon Papers. Ellsberg was invited to join the team that compiled these documents, all of which were kept a secret from President Johnson. McNamara himself was afraid of the implications of the documents, saying that, quote, they could hang people for what's in there. Eventually, the role of Secretary of Defense overwhelmed McNamara so much that President Johnson pushed him out of his job. His secret report on Vietnam, however, continued and remained unknown to all but the team that had worked to piece them together. Ellsberg eventually left government service to return to the Rand Corporation, but he was called back to D.C. after the Tet Offensive to help consult the new Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford. The Tet Offensive was a massive attack by Viet Cong forces on South Vietnamese targets. To counteract this offensive, Westmoreland, the commanding general of U.S. forces in Vietnam, secretly requested 200,000 more troops from President Johnson. However, his secret report was leaked. An outcry from members of Congress and the American public against the increase in manpower was swift and powerful, which stopped Johnson from escalating the conflict. Even though Ellsberg did not leak the report, it showed him that leaking could be a patriotic and constructive act. Public outrage against the Vietnam War dissuaded Lyndon B. Johnson from trying to get a second term, and the Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey, lost the election to Richard Nixon because of his unwillingness to condemn the Vietnam War. Nixon was so bent on using the conflict in Vietnam to his advantage that his campaign manager contacted the South Vietnamese, telling them to hold off on peace talks until Nixon won, as he would be a stronger ally. After winning the presidential election, Richard Nixon hired Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State, who brought back Ellsberg into D.C. from his job at the Rand Corporation. However, after only a few months in office, the Nixon administration was embroiled in a scandal, as accusations of U.S. bombings in Cambodia were made against the administration by newspaper outlets. These accusations were quieted by government denial, but Daniel Ellsberg knew they were true because he had looked through new additions to the Pentagon Papers. In the summer of 1969, Ellsberg attempted to read the Pentagon Papers in their entirety. He discovered that efforts to stage elections in Vietnam were denied by the U.S. for fear that Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, might have won. He also found out that troops had been sent into the Vietnam War far earlier than public knowledge stated, and that for 23 years and 4 administrations, the U.S. government had been lying about the Vietnam War. After attending a peace protest, Ellsberg decided that he had enough, and that he was going to release the papers to the public.
Everyone says that changed everything because from that point on, people were much more cynical about the government and much less likely to just say, oh, well, if the president says it, it must be true. And that's never changed back again. And it's gone, I think, to an extreme now where the country's so divided that more than half the country doesn't believe a single thing that our current president says.
Right.
During the month of October 1969, Ellsberg copied the Pentagon Papers one by one with one of his coworkers from the Rand Corporation. Ellsberg approached multiple public figures, such as Senator Fulbright, but none seemed interested in making the papers public. Frustrated, Ellsberg reached out to Neil Sheehan, a New York Times reporter he had known. After receiving a copy and conversing with his boss, Sheehan decided to publish the Pentagon Papers, and the New York Times printed the first entry in 1971. After the Times published their first entry of the Pentagon Papers, the Nixon administration sent a telegram to the Times ordering them to stop. This action, known as prior restraint, was unconstitutional, and a judicial battle was abound. The Supreme Court took on the judicial battle between the Times and the presidential administration, and on June 30th, 1971, they handed down a 6-3 decision to allow the Times to keep printing. As more papers were leaked, the public slowly discovered they had been lied to regarding the Vietnam War. Ellsberg faced trial in 1973 on ground of espionage charges, but the charges were dropped after the court discovered that the Nixon administration obtained evidence for the trial illegally.
Ellsberg's whole point was to try to end the war, and obviously he didn't do it in the way he imagined. He thought maybe there'd be some uprising and Congress would intervene and the war would end, and that didn't happen that way at all, but it did lead to other things, including eventually Watergate. And that, I think, did have a big impact because Nixon and Kissinger both kind of admitted, they weren't ashamed of it, that they would have continued, even after this peace deal, they would have continued bombing or resumed bombing again if it hadn't been for the political weakness that was caused by Watergate.
Ellsberg's leaking of the Pentagon Papers created a large degree of mistrust between the government and its people and created the precedent for confidential leaks. The same issue of secretive actions by the government continues to plague U.S. society today, as whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden have exposed the true nature of federal operations such as the NSA's extensive domestic surveillance. Although the immediate impact of Ellsberg's revelations have subsided, the lessons gained from his bravery are still relevant as he took a stand against a corrupt and deceptive government and shook the conscience of a nation.